ask ourselves, upon what does our health and hygiene depend? What kind of intelligence must be assimilated more deeply in order to really understand and act in ways that make you and your loved ones safer, healthier, stronger over short and long periods of time? Upon what do the benevolent rather than the destructive effects of the economy depend? Upon what does your ability to feel restorative naturalness in your body depend? Upon what does a sane rather than hellish future for technological civilization depend? They all depend on the same one thing: the conscious and unconscious fidelity of human systems to nature's patterns.
At this stage, we're heading towards a planetary scale civilization. It may be the first time we've had one here on Earth, and we need a story that can provide the unifying power for that scale and that level of complexity of civilization to be successful. Clearly, the way we're doing it now, with the breakdown of neoliberal approach to globalization or planetary scale civilization, isn't working the way it needs to work. So I think it's worth having this conversation.
So all these positions, I think, whether we call them weird naturalism or weird realism or supernaturalism, are all really pointing us to, I think, the greater mystery and depth of the natural. And that would be, I think one important way or facet to really get at the topic of sacred naturalism.
True religion is evidence-supported ultimate commitment. Faith is the act of commitment to creative good. Revelation is the transforming power that operates in religious fellowship. The world is saved by creative transformation, which was Wyman's stand-in for grace.
It turns out that science is for helping us to understand reality. Myth and religion is for helping us relate to reality. And that's why personification is not an option. If we don't personify, that is, if we don't relate personally to primary reality, we tend to exploit it. And that's the essence of unsustainability.
An integral sacred naturalism is basically a type of belief, not like where you believe that there is inherent meaning or value in the cosmos, but a type of belief like deciding to believe, choosing to see life as sacred, as valuable, as meaningful, as important, as God, as divine, as sacred.
Other scholars, like Michael Martyr, find that thinking about plants leads to a post-metaphysical position. That in their being, plants challenge Western metaphysical conceptions. After my research, I believe that looking at trees and plants more closely leads to a metaphysical position that's more complex than we have yet imagined, what I'm tentatively calling a lush metaphysic.
So still balancing is this flux flow art form of doing and becoming and creating, but also in the act of doing all of that, the space of witness, of allowing your balance to go back to the earth so that you may go through the process again.
Welcome to the integral stage. The reality of anthropogenic climate change is one of the most pressing and controversial questions of our time. It's likely a topic we will debate here on the integral stage in the near future. It's quite a divisive issue, at least in the United States. But regardless of where we stand on the question of whether or not the climate changes currently underway are related to our human activities, I think it's still clear, one, that significant changes are afoot, and we are going to have to learn how to manage and adjust to them, if not thrive. And two, that the way we're living in modern techno-industrial culture is not sustainable in the long term and is having a significantly negative impact on many of the living systems of the planet. When we look at the growing pollution and, in some places, the irradiation of the sea, our toxic electronic waste, the massive islands of trash in the ocean, the precipitous decline of sea life, birds and other animals choking on our plastics, the loss of biodiversity with our animal population dropping by 50% in the last handful of decades, and species going extinct at an unprecedented rate since the last mass extinction event 65 million years ago. I could go on, but it's clear that we've become a planet-shaping force, determining the living conditions, not only for ourselves, but for millions of other life forms. How are we handling that? How are we managing our potential for impact on the planet's precious living systems? I think most of us can recognize that we can do better. We're not living in alignment with the hard-won intelligence and the inescapable limits of this little blue island in the cold and impassable void. Atheists and religionists alike are coming to see that any sustainable lifeways of the future will have to include, again, a capacity to think and live ecologically. This means learning how the Earth system manages herself and finding ways to work creatively with that. We can no longer treat the world as an infinite storehouse or as a neutral background for our human dramas. It means evolving how we understand what natural means and questioning the human-natural distinction altogether. In integral terms, it means, among other things, acknowledging the self-destructive consequences of relating to the living world only as an it, and not also as an I and a thou and a we. With Timothy Morton and Donna Haraway, we may need to begin to dissolve or blur the concept of individual species, to see ourselves as entangled with the non-human and to cultivate a new solidarity. With Raimon Panikar, we may need to bring the sacred and the secular together, to inhabit a sacred secularity, which no longer values the timeless above the time-bound and the becoming. With Deleuze and David Abram, we may need to become animal again. In this Wheel of Perspectives discussion, I've invited a number of distinctive voices to reflect on the question of a sacred naturalism, not necessarily as a distinct spiritual system or ism, but as a living sensibility, a wisdom that's attuned to the rhythms and the patterns of the greater world on which we depend, which may find expression inside or outside of any particular cultural or religious container. The challenge of living rightly with the world is a divergent problem, not a convergent one. There's no one right way to do this, but there is the hope that considering multiple perspectives together will help us connect more deeply to the possibilities ahead and to each other in our collective enactment of this promise. Our Wheel of Perspectives panel today includes Michael Dowd, a minister and eco-theologian who has been passionately advocating for a sacred or religious naturalist perspective for several decades now. Tim Winton, who has done important work on sustainability and who developed pattern dynamics, a unique language to explore, align with, and enact the dynamic patterns and processes of living systems. Chris Dierkes, a former Anglican minister who now teaches on various shamanic, contemplative, and healing practices. Laura Pustarfi, an integral ecologist who focuses in her work on learning to phenomenologically contact plant intelligence and to develop an arboreal philosophy. Dave McLeod, a jazz musician and ecological theorist who's helped Tim Winton develop pattern dynamics. Kai Drachenberg, a professional photographer and a practitioner of stone balancing as an expression of eco-spirituality. David Long, a YouTube personality who's been developing a naturalist and emergentist version of integral theory. And Layman Pascal, an accomplished integrative meta-theorist and a spiritual teacher who recently led a several-week course called Psyche and Nature on this question of sacred naturalism. In this video, each participant will share his or her unique take on the nature and promise of a sacred naturalism. And if there's interest, we will follow this up with a round 2 open panel discussion. I hope you enjoy.
Sacred naturalism. Sacred naturalism means, in the same breath, both a naturalistic description of sacredness and a sacred description of naturalness. What does that mean? Well, it means accounting for all the very profound and useful facets of existential, spiritual, and religious experience, accounting for them from out of the logic and discoveries of the natural sciences, including cognitive science. And it means a morally powerful and personally transformative grasp of the transcendental and redemptive nature of nature herself, right? I'd like to say for some reason that the holiness of the natural is not a second-rank phenomenon. It's not an intellectual curiosity or a recreational triviality compared to our professional modern lives. It's not naively this-worldly, as opposed to an ascended otherworldly heaven, or opposed to some unthinkably unconditional consciousness that has left the manifest universe behind. Those kinds of ideas are clumsy, hasty, misleading. We do not any longer occupy a flat material nature of coarse mortal bodies with an official golden sun king or even a great emptiness above us at the apex of some pyramid of increasingly impersonal abstractions. Today, that is a sickness, an untruth. Today, we are always already embedded, hyper-personally and very vitally, within an omnidirectional surround sound atmosphere of interactive participatory patterning. That is what ecosystem means. The environment, the living sphere, the invisible mycelial syntax implicit in every direction, that is the central idea now, the luminous crux of the matter. Higher and deeper are suddenly the same when we are in and of an ecosystem that surrounds and interpenetrates above and below. There's no gap between the spiritual and the material. And there needn't be any gap between the anthropological and the ontological, between the technological and the biological, the rational and the intuitive, the semantic and the energetic, or at least there needn't be such a gap. Our human mind in its integrative mode can absolutely become better and better aligned with the patterning styles of the pervasive local and transcendental biosphere of which it is an essential part. Society and economy, architecture, energy production, these things can and should be more compatible, more interoperable with the forms and strategies of the natural cosmos. The logic of the one should take on the patterns of the other. Psyches and bodies must come closer together, inspect each other more fully, and reflect each other more profoundly. This twinning, this mirroring, this higher fidelity capture of, or better dancing with, the complex, evolving biomaterial, bioenergetic universe is the alchemical mechanism by which naturalness is produced. And yes, I say produced. Naturalness does not typify nature at all times. Natural is a more precise and valuable outcome. Nature is vast, much of it unfriendly, horrific, and stupid. Nature gets in her own way. Although she unfolds paradises of beautiful abundance and unbelievable charm and deeply informed instinctive efficiencies, she cannot keep them from crashing into each other for very long. Systems and species go astray, become pathological, suicidal, toxic. We are one of those species. Like every other sentient species, we lose the Dharma and we gain the Dharma. We go off course and we come back into alignment. We arise with built-in sensitivity to a quality of experience, a type of patterning, a way of being that seems most natural. Our style of naturalization, our functional and aesthetic telos. Nature has equipped us with the capacity to invent and evaluate and cultivate and protect and project naturalness within, without, and among. This makes us like all the other beings who are always seeking and co-creating their natural experience to the best of their ability. Our species, however, is notably complex, inventive, and metaphorical. We can go much further astray much faster, but we are also much more general and adaptive and precise in our ability to understand and serve this all-pervading cosmic and biospheric drive to cultivate naturalness and to enter more deeply into a relationship with that naturalness. Drive is a metaphor, of course. We're not talking about a magical force that enters the world from outside and propels us toward a predetermined destiny. And yet there is a kind of teleological dimension to this. There is a set of aesthetics, a kind of experience, a qualitative set of types of patterning toward which all nature converges, slowly, creatively, relativistically, contextually, all things being equal, which they usually aren't. It's hit or miss, but there is something to hit, a mark, a variable success mode. All organisms try to secure their homeostatic balance and then to deepen and enhance their sense of empowering fittedness to multiple environments. They seek a peculiar and satisfying ratio. A particular balance is being preserved and amplified. Chaotically, yes, but there is pattern in chaos. We know that now. Naturalness is the strange attractor in nature's algorithmic mandala, and it requires the participation of beings, in particular of sapient beings like ourselves. We know all too well the spectrum of possible human interactions with nature. We know about ecologically sourced peak experiences that indicate high fidelity constructive mutuality between inner and outer environments. We also know about the titanic emergency of multiple simultaneous ecological and epistemological crises, indicating the terrible inadequacy of the partnership between psyche and nature. There are heavens and hells in how we dance with nature and how we know her well or not well enough. We are not responsible, of course, for everything that bedevils society from out of fickle nature and happenstance, but we can and should try to be more responsive and responsible for the situations upon which we most depend. We have the opportunity to want that. And we do not know everything about the causes of ecological changes, but we can learn more. And what's more important, we can learn to operate more sanely and righteously and productively, even in a world we cannot completely control or even understand. Everything in nature has evolved and is evolving to try to thrive in a world it cannot completely control or understand or even see clearly. That is an essential part of the pattern in nature that we must more deeply assimilate. How well do you really grasp nature's mechanism? How well do we all? It's complex, interactive, multiple, local and non-local, hidden and revealed, changing and persisting, butterfly wings turning into hurricanes and back again. Our knowledge is endlessly inadequate, and even where we are not ignorant or deluded, we face a computational situation of nonlinear processes and technically unpredictable interactions that might be in principle unknowable by brains like ours. This situation is remarkably akin to the sense of religion in all phases of cultural history. Religion is a personal and public confession of our relationship to a mysterious, intelligent, non-human power upon which our well-being depends, in which we live, to which we must be more responsible, and in which is inscribed a patterning that holds the key to whether we behave in ways that empower us, provide us with meaning, and improve our private and shared worlds or not. That kind of divinity sounds an awful lot like nature, and it makes naturalness sound an awful lot like redemption, and makes transcendence and shared moral commitment sound a literally awe-filled lot like the things natural science might be able to speak about intelligibly. Amen, amen, amen. There is in nature and of nature a patterning that we can get better at knowing, but which will always move in mysterious ways beyond our capacity to track in a linear fashion and move in depths prior to our ability to label the significances of things. It is absolutely essential to learn and make conscious changes, of course, in how we operate in our personal and collective and economic lives in relation to the ecosystems around us. But this is not enough. There are so many dynamics in so many directions so urgently, and so many of them are indefinitely complex that we cannot rely on a straightforward socialized conscious knowledge. We also absolutely require a motivating instinct, an intuition, an omnidirectional embodiment of some kind of wisdom that makes us better at dealing better with essential but always partly unknown and ever-sprawling facets of being. Our body, our cells, our unconscious minds, our relationships, our environment, our cosmos, our nest of computational webs. These are the things of which we cannot get a perfect overview. They are endlessly surprising. It is like standing before a god, is it not? It is like having a soul, an intelligence hidden from your mind and your senses. It is like having an ethical mission with consequences for the world that must be acted in every moment, in every relationship, private and public. It is utterly appropriate to think of our need for enhanced ecological intelligence as a religious issue. Issue. This need spans countries, it spans cultures, it is fundamental, it is edifying or disastrous, it is individually transformative, it enfolds peak experiences and gives purpose to life. It describes the means by which we are restored, regenerated, recreated. It is no accident that passing back into the immersive living cathedral of the forest, the river, the mountain is called recreation, recreation, the regenerative creativity of being, which is not equally present everywhere, but specifically intensified where particular types of arrangements are found and in which we can participate. Amen, amen, amen. Nature is the primary location of holy sites. Before, during, and after the age of the great dogmatic religions, there enduringly remains the experiential sanctification of the landscape, the plants, the sky, the soul of the body. We did not exceed this living reality in the abstract leap from paganism to monotheism and then secularism. The successes of every stage of our thinking have always depended upon how well they actually incorporate the logic of nature into themselves. It is the logic of what works. From the first shamans to the most recent mystics, there has been an eternal refrain. Return to the body. Feel the flow of life that arises when you neurosomatically inhabit this organism more deeply. To go up is to go within. The doorway is nuanced in the thresholds. Return to the senses. See the inconceivably rich power that glows in the rose, in the sunset, the lightning, the rain, in love and in touch. This is the self more than even the self is, as I'm sure you will agree. There is no tradition of wisdom that does not say to take a breath. Receive the atmosphere into yourself and really see it, feel it. Bring the mind closer to touch that internalization of nature in yourself, and what will happen? A vitalization, a clarification, an expansion of the meaning of the mind and of the body, the amplification of naturalness in every improved interface between psyche and nature. All religion may therefore be judged for how well it enables this holy upgrade in embodied sanctity. Buddhists have taught us to feel the breath while we track the mind. That is usefully suggestive. Christians have told us of the resurrection of the flesh and of the redemptive power of naturalized emotions such as empathy, compassion, and appreciation. Taoists have asked us to let our minds be more like natural rivers and forests and the hills, beyond speech labels and social categories. In their authentic moments, they have all cried out for greater fidelity between nature's patterns and human systems. And now our mathematical priests and our machine builders have discovered that incandescent dynamic fractal patterns can live within our electric devices. Nature's patterns unveiled in the hearts of the information machines. Our psychedelic philosophers have pointed to the transcendental object that appears in the mind when it receives vivid data from the botanical entheogens of the forest. Our science, our design theory turns now to biomimicry to discover beauty and efficiency of form. Our energy systems, we know, must become more like the plants that harvest the sunlight, the wind, and the atom in vast hidden mycelial webs of empowerment. Evolution and anti-fragility and the many Dionysian logics of nature are revealed to our thinkers now. And the self-enhancing, self-stabilizing power of the biosphere rises through humanly provided feedback machines to tell us the temperature, the chemistry, the heartbeat of the world in real time. We are the becoming responsible of nature, and it is happening now. Our economic systems must naturalize by incorporating the value of nature's resources into their quantitative calculations, such that the invisible hand has the opportunity to accommodate the environment. It cannot optimize what it is not told about. The system must reflect nature's patterns. Our voting systems must improve their capacity to pass richer data from the natural environment and natural human experience into the actual social decisions that result from our specific decision protocols. Our technological interfaces must feel more natural to use and enrich our embodied organic health and complexity rather than narrowing it through bad habits, bad radiation, and bad information ecology. These are profoundly interconnected moral and practical demands. Altogether, they represent something that is the house of the law of God. We must dare, I think, the intensity of accepting the spiritual and ethical promise revealed by the reality of the natural sciences, but with the clarifying and motivating power classically associated with religiousness. Can you draw a good picture of the earth? Not the countries, but the mountains, the continents, the rivers, the forests. That is not trivial. Your entire ability to operate in tandem with nature depends on how deeply and accurately you have assimilated its actual patterns. The fate of the world depends on this. It is your task from above and below and around and beyond and within. It is your task from above and below and around and beyond and within. Sit down with your family and watch the videos that illustrate the hives within ourselves and the lives of the coral reefs. Sit down and ask everyone to check in with and experimentally language their tacit feeling sense about the ecosystem. Sit down and study one plant in ever greater detail as Goethe advised us to do. Go out, Make yourselves go out and let yourselves be seduced into the logos of uncanny ambiguity and fertile glimpses that lure us forward in those strange places of natural immersion that might as well be the enchanted otherworld of archaic lore. Bathe in the forest, lie down in the moss, put your head under the waterfall. This is information that you need. Feel the rain on your scalp and the sand in your toes, the sunlight on your skin. Smell your food and nibble all the local plants. These are many ways of internalizing nature's situation. They are not trivial things. They are like unto a holy demand. I know you are already moved to do these kinds of things, but you must do them more deeply, more often, and with a greater sense of all that depends upon this improvement of the human internalization of the patterns of actual nature. Rich naturalness of outcomes, integrated diversity of ecosystems, satisfying socio-technological interpenetration with the natural world, increased incidence and intensities of peak experiences, complex beautification of our world, instinctive participatory responsibility for personal strength and general well-being. These are the sacred results of this mirroring process, this assimilation process, this ongoing effort to make the inner like the other, the within like the without. As above, so below is not a given fact, it is a task. And the above is all around, between and within. We ask ourselves, upon what does our health and hygiene depend? What kind of intelligence must be assimilated more deeply in order to really understand and act in ways that make you and your loved ones safer, healthier, stronger over short and long periods of time? Upon what do the benevolent rather than the destructive effects of the economy depend? Upon what does your ability to feel restorative naturalness in your body depend? Upon what does a sane rather than hellish future for technological civilization depend? They all depend on the same one thing, the conscious and unconscious fidelity of human systems to nature's patterns. That resonance is what selects in nature and produces naturalness across all the phenomenological domains. To say that natural is an interpretation is only to say that we are needed in order to produce it. To say that natural is relative is only to say that it must come forth from every being with every perspective, in every center of the web and in every root of the tree. Each of us is needed in this task. Each of us must grow more powerful in their capacity to receive and embody and enact naturalness in all dimensions at all times, and with the motivating instinctive clarity of the unconscious intelligence of life that can and should see more clearly through our eyes. Make your instincts smarter, cultivate them, feed them new knowledge gained by machines and statistics and experiments, but really feed it to them. Do not collapse social knowledge into the conscious foyer of the mind, the merely ostensibly known and socially reinforced facts of the case, but rather break down the data into fertilizer and feed it to the plant in your soul so that it starts to automatically act from an omnidirectional command of the information whose ecological outcomes you could never calculate. There is another one in you. Another intelligence, a God of vines and branchings and deep interweavings, a God of the enveloping sphere, a spirit of the trees, a spirit of the mycelial protocognitive logical syntax that blindly finds the meanings upon which perception and cognition themselves depend, in ourselves and in every other creature and swarm and network. A spirit of nuances, a song among the cells, a holographic face that appears when your natural subsystems work more profoundly in concert with each other, expanded into wonderment and raining insight back down upon the waking and dreaming souls of people, cities, organizations, machines, and knowledges. This one has bid me to say these things, to speak of a naturalistic approach to sacredness that is at once also a sacred approach to naturalness. It tells me that the way to maximize intuitive faith, amplify peak experiences, and optimize our efforts in the matter of cultural and ecological crises are all the same way. It is the way of protecting and producing more naturalness by increasing the informational fidelity between human systems and detailed natural patterns. This is how you build the diaphanous living cathedral in which the enfolded evolutionary architecture of our nature is revealed, seen through, improved, and refined into the numinous coherence. Sacred naturalism in my mouth means that nature and humanity can and should reflect each other better. This is a religion of science, a religion for those who are spiritual but not religious, a religion for those who remember the golden moments in the past history of every classical religion, a religion of these bodies, these minds, these instincts, and this world, in this moment and in every next. That is the North Pole to which our magnets have always pointed. And the time to take active, dynamic, cultural, and transcultural responsibility for the health and transfigurational potential of our lives within ecosystems is right now. Amen, amen, amen. Whew.
Hi everyone, Tim Winton here. I'd like to thank Bruce and Layman for asking me to present on the topic of sacred naturalism for the integral stage. The perspective I'd like to contribute to this conversation is perhaps best situated as a historical one. So I'm going to start out with a quote from the historian Arnold Toynbee. Toynbee's seen as a kind of big picture or systemic historian who looks for patterns throughout history. And I'll just read a quote from Wikipedia about his work. It's about what's called the universal church. Toynbee developed his concept of an internal proletariat and an external proletariat to describe quite different opposition groups within and outside the frontiers of a civilization. These groups, however, find themselves bound to the fate of the civilization. During its decline and disintegration, they are increasingly disenfranchised or alienated and lose their immediate sense of loyalty or obligation. Nonetheless, an internal proletariat, untrusting of the dominant minority, may form a universal church, which survives the civilization's demise, co-opting the useful structures such as marriage laws of the earlier time, etc., while creating a new philosophical and religious pattern for the next stage of history. Before the process of disintegration, the dominant minority had held the internal proletariat in subjugation within the confines of the civilization, causing these oppressed to grow bitter. The external proletariat, living outside the civilization in poverty and chaos, grows envious. Then, in the social stress resulting from the failure of the civilization, the bitterness and envy increase markedly. Toynbee argues that as civilizations decay, there is a schism within the society. In this environment of discord, people resort to archaism, that is, an idealization of the past, futurism, an idealization of the future, detachment, removal of oneself from the realities of a decaying world, and an internal proletariat who transcend the social decay. A church may arise. Such an association would contain new and stronger spiritual insights, around which a subsequent civilization may begin to form. Toynbee here uses the word church in a general sense, for example, to refer to a collective spiritual bond found in common worship, or the utility found in an agreed social order. So what I find interesting about that is it sounds remarkably like what's happening within our own world, and that we're entering that phase of industrial modernity or the Western dominant cultural socio-economic mode. The way Toynbee describes this breakdown sounds remarkably what's going on for us now. That is, we have an external proletariat, and if you're inside the Western system, then they can be referred to as terrorists or people from the outside trying to destroy our system. We have an internal proletariat, which I'll talk about in a minute, which the integral community or the integral diaspora, as I think Bruce has referred to some of us, may form part of the conversation, at least, of what an internal proletariat, or the conversation that is going on amongst the internal proletariat of the West during this breakdown phase. But we can see things like an idealization of the past, an idealization of the future with machine intelligence and artificial intelligence and some of the stories that are going on there. We can see the detachment, people going back to the hills and becoming more self-reliant. And we can also see the transcendence part, I think. That is some new way of coming to a fundamental view about the nature of experience or reality that unifies people under that kind of cosmological umbrella. So that's what I want to talk about in relation to sacred naturalism, because I think often, at least from the integral view, we have this developmental idea that nature and any kind of sacred or spiritual aspect that has to do with the natural world fits within this category of nature mysticism, which I think is real. Often nature is a portal or an entryway into the view that the subject and the object aren't as separate as you think, and that really there's this kind of a holistic experience, that the unfolding process of the natural world that you can unify with in nature is very accessible. And often in our overly technological society, we're removed from that opportunity, and sometimes when we get the chance to be back in nature, that's the first time we may experience that kind of unity experience. So what I want to say about sacred naturalism then is that it could go beyond that. We could really bring a kind of naturalism back to the conversation about where we're going next. If the mechanistic, materialist view of our technological society isn't providing enough of that overarching story to unify us, then what's next? It's the job of the internal proletariat. And as I said, I would include myself in that as a member of the integral community or as diaspora. And I think there's a much larger conversation which integral views can inform or become a part of within that conversation. And the naturalism part is really interesting. When I spoke to Bruce, when he invited me to present here, I asked him the question. I said, well, are we talking about the kind of naturalism here that's the kind of realist, scientific, causes-based naturalism that it gets framed as philosophically, or are we talking about that more nature mysticism, unity experience with the gross realm, the natural world? And he said, well, both. And from an integral view, we should be able to talk about both and their relationships and differences and see what that yields. And I agree with him. I think that there's an opportunity here to bring a view of sacred naturalism to this conversation that can help inform the story, the big story that we hold about our world, our reality, our experience, that historically Toynbee talks about as the unifying force that's brought forward by the internal proletariat during the breakdown phase, and when the story of the dominant minority starts to lose its ability to serve that purpose. The reason I think that an approach where we come back to the sacred through a kind of naturalism or the natural world is useful is because currently we have an external proletariat and we have a view of the sacred which doesn't resonate. So there's a conflict there. And the job of the internal proletariat is to come up with a story that's more overarching, that will unify more people and the force of renewal after the breakdown. So what is that unifying force or story? Well, the one we've got is that the sacred is attached to God, and that God is old-fashioned and out of date, and in fact kind of like a fairy tale, or the gods, or anything that's theistic or spiritual is anachronistic. It's not a part of the modern conversation. Well, that's what we've got, and we're alienating an external proletariat with that story. So maybe just swinging back from a kind of hardcore materialism within the modern, postmodern Western paradigm back to another extreme of that kind of spirituality or approach to the sacred, where it's very idealist again. We tried that, it's not working. I'm not sure that that's the best approach going forward. What I have advocated and what I'm interested in is exploring a story of the sacred which has naturalistic foundations, that doesn't require a metaphysics that's overly idealistic. That is, where the interior aspect of our experience or reality is the dominant feature of anything that we explain as spiritual or sacred. I think that it might be more useful and pragmatic, from the sense that we explain pragmatism as the effects we perceive something to have, than the effects that we perceive an overly idealized approach to spirituality to have isn't as good as it could be. Let's put it that way. So I'm wondering if a more balanced approach to the sacred, one that's more rooted in a naturalistic, not necessarily materialist, but at least where there's a fine integration of the realist and the idealist views, and that somehow in that overlapping ground there's a story that can unite all of humanity. The internal proletariat with this new story, the external proletariat who will accept it, and of course the renewal, the bulk of the people will be participating in a new system. And I guess at this stage we're heading towards a planetary scale civilization. It may be the first time we've had one here on Earth, and we need a story that can provide the unifying power for that scale and that level of complexity of civilization to be successful. Clearly, the way we're doing it now, with the breakdown of neoliberal approach to globalization or planetary scale civilization, isn't working the way it needs to work. So I think it's worth having this conversation. So what does sacred naturalism look like that's of that ilk, that can provide a kernel of a story, or at least a kernel for the conversation of the process of a story going forward after the breakdown phase? What's the renewal? I mean, that's exciting and interesting. I think we're all a bit trepidatious or nervous about this breakdown phase. At least it seems that way. But thinking about the renewal is a much more exciting and invigorating project. We might talk about it as an exercise in what I might call the process of creatively shaping the internal proletariat of the breakdown phase of industrial modernity via integral post-metaphysical practices. That's a really wordy mouthful for what can integral post-metaphysics contribute to a conversation about sacred naturalism in that historical context. So nature, in the integral terms, is associated with the gross realm. It has that, but it also has a sacred aspect, this unity. We can observe and experience the unified whole of a process of which we are deeply embedded as the nature of experience. I mean, that becomes quite real in some naturalistic settings, but nature also has this concrete or very gross aspect to it. It's undeniable. So that's an interesting confluence of the ideal and the realist view. Within nature, the driving force or fundamental aspect of nature is energetic. And that energy has a curious ontological status. It's something you can measure. That is, it has objectiveness or a realist quality, but you can't ever touch it or poke it with a stick. It has that idealist quality. It has an aliveness with animate things and processes and the unfolding flow of experience, but it's not material. So we can use energy as a kind of naturalistic foundation that has room, at least, for the more idealist spiritual views of traditional and integrals, and also for the more material views demanded by, or these realist views demanded by modernity. So I'll end off there. I'm looking forward to the conversation, and we'll see you then.
A way into exploring the idea of sacred naturalism that I'd like to look at today is the idea of what's called weird naturalism or supernaturalism. This is an idea that's been gaining some traction of late, and a number of thinkers been creating kind of a confluence of similar ideas, I think, in this vein. Eric Davis has a new book out on what he calls weird naturalism. Timothy Morton and Graham Harman have a book on weird realism. Jeffrey Kripal and Whitley Strieber have a book called Supernaturalism, and Dean Radin has a book called Supernormal. And in their various ways, I think they're all kind of pointing in a similar direction and really charting a new way forward. Because largely, I think we've been caught in a sort of classic negative double bind. On the one hand, we've had kind of atomistic, classic scientistic, materialist atheism when it comes to things like the high strange and the mysterious and the mystical. And so that's all considered, illusion or delusion. And then on the other hand, to the degree that it's been accepted, we've had those kind of phenomena and experiences largely placed within the realm of classic religious metaphysics or new agey, or even into kind of paranormal kinds of studies. And it's sort of off in this sort of spooky corner over here somewhere. And it's this kind of weird thing that we keep locked over there. And in that case, those experiences are really tied to a very specific kind of religious system or metaphysical system, and the interpretation and the framework for understanding and the meaning of those experiences is pretty much entirely wedded to those systems. So you have to buy into the system to have the experience, and they're kind of totally tied together. Or on the other side, with the kind of atheistic sense, you critique the system, therefore the experience is bunk. And what I think all these thinkers are pointing to is kind of charting a different course here, which gets out of this double bind, which is weird naturalism or supernaturalism. So instead of the idea that these kinds of experiences, psi phenomena, precognition, mystical experiences, synchronicities, the high, strange, the anomalous. Instead of thinking of those as existing from another order of being, supernatural meaning above nature, from some other plane of reality, we just see them as intensified supernatural experiences. They're intense or beautiful or mystical or strange or weird or anomalous versions, but still within the bounds of the normal. They might be rarer forms of the normal, they might be more intense, they might be more confusing or numinous or mysterious, but they're still within the bounds of the normal, the natural, however we would describe that. And again, for example, Dean Radin's work, I think, is really important in this light. For decades now, he's been repeatedly showing under classic laboratory conditions that psi phenomena are just real. That the classic definitions of magic, which is that consciousness and intent can have causal impact and shape material forces in reality, is just real. Now, in the general population, his evidence is pretty clear. It's fairly dispersed, and the impact is not super extraordinary necessarily because it's pretty dissipated. But in certain individuals, it can be a highly cultivated art. It's not an overwhelming influence that controls everything and anything. It's not, you know, nonsense pop versions like The Secret or something, or like millions of dollars are going to fall off of trees or fall out of the sky or some nonsense like that. But nevertheless, like, psi phenomena is very real. Precognition is real. People have real encounters in altered states with what they perceive to be other dimensions or other worlds with entities or presences or forces or energies. And it's all very natural, actually, and normal. So we don't have to think of it as weird and spooky and off in a corner somewhere. Or also, we don't need to look for a bunch of answers to debunk these things, which is what the so-called skepticist or kind of materialist position is really just kind of trying to deny people's experience. In this other way of thinking, there's an openness to the fact that these experiences are real, however we understand real, but they're much more open in terms of their interpretation. You know, the problem with the kind of classic version where there's kind of the realm of nature and then there's this supernatural realm above, and these revelatory experiences are from up and they're coming down, is they always get to claim special revelation or get to claim an unassailable, uncritiquable position because whatever, so-and-so said so, or some ascended master or some light being or whatever and told me that this is what's the case. There's no sense of interpretation. There's no sense of dynamism. There's no sense of meaning making and translation and the possibilities of misunderstanding or applying information. All of that gets kind of thrown out with a very top-down model on the one hand, or on the other hand, it's all just bunk. So all these positions, I think, whether we call them weird naturalism or weird realism or supernaturalism, are all really pointing us to, I think, the greater mystery and depth of the natural. And that would be, you know, I think one important way or facet to really get at the topic of sacred naturalism. So we have sacred and naturalism. Then we're adding a piece, I guess, here, which is the weird or the strange or the anomalous is natural, but then also it has some touch point into what is sacred or holy. And I mean, classically, the great sort of mood or response to the sacred is awe. That's really the classic human emotive, affective kind of state of being in response to the sacred, to the holy. And so I think a sacred naturalism needs to focus quite a bit on awe. And then I would say there's kind of two kinds of awe. And a sacred naturalism, I think, would need to contend with both. So one kind of awe, which we're probably familiar with, is the kind, for example, you walk up a big hike, up a hill or a mountain, and you get to some really beautiful panoramic view, and you see this incredible broad landscape, and you get the eagle's eye view, and there's just this sense of, wow, your breath gets taken away, and there's just a kind of wonder in what is. The other kind of awe, interestingly, is principally and classically described as holy fear, or a sense of terror, or the terrible, not necessarily evil, but this kind of overwhelming awe and kind of on the edge of a power greater than oneself. And it can be both simultaneously fascinating and terrifying, or even sometimes repulsive or really frightening, truthfully. And so, for example, Graham Harman's book on weird realism is a series of essays on Lovecraft. So there's a big revival of the philosophy of horror, and like Edgar Allan Poe and Lovecraft and these kinds of individuals who are willing to explore this kind of what we might call darker or holy terror, holy fear side of the awe equation, where it's can be really quite on the edge of both ecstasy and fear. Whereas the first one, up on top of the mountain, is a little more pacific and placid and lovely and beautiful and serene. The second one's a little wilder, a little potentially more on the edge, a little more primal. And again, I think a sacred naturalism would need to really contend with both, and the relationship of both, and not just do the light side or the dark side, but try to find a way to bring them together. So there are a lot of implications that kind of flow from this. One is how we deal with awe as a consequence. Another is the kind of epistemology and hermeneutics and ontology of allowing these experiences to be more part of the natural order of things. But I think there's also ways that we can explore the strange or the anomalous or the hidden, the occult, so-called, and that which has kind of been hidden coming to the surface in terms of history and politics and economics. A weird realism or weird naturalism or a sacred naturalism, I think, would also bring back and really seek to bridge the divide between science and the numinous in a new way, in a very distinct way. A way that has had individuals pointing in that direction over history, but would be, I think, revived and in some ways really articulated. In particular, I think a weird realism where we understand that this stuff is real, but we don't know quite what real means or how it's real, I think would help us to reconnect to the much deeper roots of alchemy and magic at the core of science, for example. So the public version of science that we're taught is that these scientists were great rationalists who overcame the superstition of magic and hermeticism and alchemy. But when we study the actual history, it turns out Kepler and Tycho Brahe and Giordano Bruno and Newton and all these figures, and Descartes, and we could just Leibniz, we could just keep going down the line of great figures in physics, mathematics, biology, medicine, who had deeply alchemical, deeply hermetic kinds of views, weird naturalist, sacred naturalist views that they were into. sacred geometry, that they were into alchemy, that they were into the idea that they could transmute phenomena, and that has a much deeper root in the actual practice and the deep consciousness of science, both for good or for ill, potentially, but that's become largely unconscious in our public narrative or the self-narrative of science. It also allows us to reconnect historically when we allow, I think, a weird naturalist position, sacred naturalist position, because we can appreciate many of the religious traditions and the metaphysical systems that interpreted and sought to create narratives and forms of meaning and understanding and cosmologies built around these kinds of anomalous or highly strange experiences that are nevertheless very common. So we can appreciate those, but we don't have to be wedded to them either. And it allows us to see the deep continuity, I think, with our ancestors of this kind of naturalistic set of phenomena. An example might be Jacques Vallée. He's a great thinker around the question of the so-called UFO phenomena, the contemporary UFO or contact phenomena. And he's shown that the form of the experience, whatever the phenomenon is, or could be, or has been, or will be, whatever it is, it interestingly shows repetitive motifs and patterns of deep similarity across time and space and culture. So that what we think of as this very modern phenomenon of the so-called UFOs, Vallée showed, for example, was pretty point for point replicated in the entire tradition of like apparitions of the Virgin Mary, or in the folklore concerning the fae folk or the fairy folk in the Celtic and the British Isles, or the jinn, the traditions of the jinn in the Near East and in Persia. And they match point by point by point by point. So that's very interesting. Whatever this phenomenon is, it's been going on actually for a long time under different guises, it might appear. The similar kinds of experiences are happening over and over and over again. They're understood differently, they're conceptualized differently. And it doesn't mean that our contemporary version of that is necessarily the right one, and all those other people were primitive, and now we really know what this whole thing was about. I think a weird sacred naturalist position is nobody knows really what the hell's going on, what's this all about. And yet, nevertheless, the mystery and the phenomena is quite real. So, given that it's a naturalistic posture, it leaves open, I think, a number of questions around ethics and choice. So the phenomena are real, but in and of themselves, they don't necessarily bring what we would necessarily call ethics. They could, but they can just as easily be used for harm as for good, truthfully, as any naturalistic phenomena could be just what it is. And it could be dependent on what intent and to what end those experiences are put. So, for example, more and more information comes to light now that over the last half century and more, intelligence agencies, for example, have had interest in weaponizing psi phenomena. As crazy as that sounds when you first hear that, like, that can't be right, but it actually really happened, and it's still happening, but it certainly has happened, where huge amounts of money and time and energy were spent studying the possibilities of essentially weaponizing psychic phenomena, highly strange phenomena. And so again, we have this kind of public version of what's shared as to what's real and what's not real. And then nevertheless, behind the scenes, we have all these high strange, alchemical, positive, or potentially sometimes negative plays upon that, which suggests to me that behind the scenes, a different kind of ontology is really at play. And I think the sacred naturalist, weird naturalist, supernaturalist, whatever you want to say, is an attempt to break down that old divide, that false binary and dialectic, which maybe even was partly a controlled dialectic, I might argue, but it, if nothing else, at least it's been a false binary where on the one hand we have the paranormal, and paranormal literally means alongside or next to. So it's like alongside of or next to reality. So it's over in a corner somewhere. And what this view is saying is just the paranormal is normal. We're just normalizing and leaving much more open. We're just making it much more ordinary. Super normal, super ordinary, but still ordinary and normal. We don't necessarily have to buy into big, complicated systems of, 49 dimensions and teachers and things and flying beings. And, you don't necessarily have to buy into that whole way in which it's been schematized and understood, but nevertheless really come to appreciate the reality and the depth and the sincerity of the reality of these phenomena. And then from there, I think all kinds of possibilities open up in terms of new forms of human creativity, of technology, where we really, again, are coming to the point where science and magic and mysticism are kind of all becoming, the lines between them are becoming blurred, let's say. There's the famous Arthur C. Clarke quotation about any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. Jeffrey Kripal flipped that equation and said, any sufficiently advanced magic is indistinguishable from technology. And I think that, again, leaves open up the possibility that all these things that have seemed strange and hidden and have been on the margins can become more and more direct and mainstream as their degrees of dissonance and I think breakdown of traditional worldviews and political parties and democratic systems, and we start to see the deeply engineered nature of politics and science and academia and culture, as people start to rebel against that, as the friction and the pain and the suffering and the just like sheer failure and patently absurd and ridiculous and ludicrous and see-through, transparently off nature of so much of what we're fed comes more and more to the fore. It breaks down a lot of the walls we have created psychically that prevent us from experiencing the other world, this world, the mysterious, the magical, natural, supernatural, weird natural, sacred natural nature. And I think that reality is becoming more transparent, more diaphanous, as all these other forms that we used to have cultural consciousness and conventional buy-in around are all breaking down. It's creating more openness to the strange and the anomalous and the weird, which again doesn't mean that those automatically are the final solution or the final answer, because they're often trickstery and puzzling and confusing and bewildering and nonlinear. But I think they do open up greater contact with reality, and the ability to ground in reality, I think, is what we're really curious for. So hopefully that makes some sense. There's just kind of a riff on the concept of sacred naturalism with a particular focus around the idea of the weird and supernatural as being really just very natural. Thanks.
Thank you, Bruce, for inviting me to participate in this series. I felt inspired to share what I am calling a brief history of Henry Nelson Wyman, who lived from 1884 to 1975. I was introduced to Henry Nelson Wyman by a dear friend and mentor who wrote his master's thesis on Wyman in 1957. Other than that, I had never heard of Henry Nelson Wyman, and I feel like there's a lot of people that don't know who he is and that should know. I now have over a dozen Wyman books in my library, so I'm hooked. I think he was a thinker that was ahead of his time. He was an early Whitehead expert. He attempted to integrate science and religion in the 1920s. He catalyzed the emergence of religious naturalism in the latter part of the 20th century, and he theorized about what we are now calling collective intelligence. His doctoral thesis at Harvard was completed in 1917, and he called it The Organization of Interests, where he argued that creativity is the best principle upon which to organize interests. So creativity and the increase of qualitative meaning was a constant theme throughout his career. His influences were at Harvard. He studied under William Ernest Hocking and Ralph Barton Perry. Perry was a student of William James, so that carried over through to Wyman. And other influences were Bergson, Dewey, and Whitehead. So Wyman's first book was published in 1926. It's called Religious Experience and the Scientific Method, where he was reconciling religion and science 72 years before Wilbur's The Marriage of Sense and Soul. He began the book with this statement. He said, "Whatever else the word God may mean, it is a term used to designate that something upon which human life is most dependent for its security, welfare, and increasing abundance." So Whitehead came to Harvard in 1924, which is after, several years after Wyman had left Harvard. But he became a really serious student of Whitehead and became known as one of America's few authorities on Whitehead. Meanwhile, at the University of Chicago, some of the professors there in the divinity school, like Shaler Matthews, the dean, were really getting interested in Whitehead, but becoming very frustrated. There's a quote from Shaler Matthews where he says he was both infuriated and embarrassed by trying to read Whitehead and recognizing words, but not putting them together and being able to understand the sentences. So Wyman was invited to the University of Chicago to give a lecture on Whitehead, and after which he was promptly hired to teach there because his lecture was so brilliant, he made Whitehead understandable. And for the next 30 years after that, the University of Chicago was kind of known as a school that was promoting Whiteheadian thought and process philosophy. But in the years that followed, Wyman kind of moved on, becoming critical of some aspects of Whitehead's thought. But his second book, written in 1927, was called The Wrestle of Religion with Truth. And Gary Dorian said that book put Whiteheadian philosophy on the map of American theology. In this book, he defined God as, quote, the most subtle and intimate complexity of environmental nature, which yields the greatest good when right adjustments is made. In general, Wyman's influence at the University of Chicago kept James's brand of radical empiricism and Whitehead's naturalistic philosophy all within a context of religious theism. They kept those concepts alive. And this was not a supernatural theism, but it was a naturalistic theism. The Source of Human Good, written in 1946, is often considered Wyman's magnum opus. When I asked my friend and mentor, Kenneth Freeman, to him, what made Wyman stand out? He responded, it was the humanism of the man. The Source of Human Good is one of his books, and it's very down to earth. And yet here's this man using this down to earth stuff to base a faith on, and a religion, and ethics, and so forth. It's all there, and you don't have to do all this other stuff. He's coming in under the line, as it were, but it's all there. Under the line, I asked? Well, he said, he's not a great big philosopher doing great big philosophy, trying to solve all the problems of the world. He was a down-to-earth human who wanted a working religion for a contemporary world, and he saw that possibility in the Source of Human Goodness. So I want to share at least one of Wyman's well-known concepts, and that was the concept that he referred to as the creative event. And late in life, he summed up his entire philosophical career by stating, that he had always been attempting to answer the question, what operates in human existence to create, save, and transform toward greatest good? So in that 1946 book, he first articulated this concept of the creative event as the manifestation of God's activity in the world, and which consisted of 4 sub-events. He placed the context of the creative event in human interactions with one another. If the phrase collective intelligence had been in use at the time, I think this concept of the creative event, or what he also later called creative interchange, would have been put in that frame. So summarily stated, the 4 sub-events of the creative event are: 1, the emerging awareness of new perspectives; 2, the integrating of these new perspectives with those previously derived; 3, the expanding and enriching of the appreciable world by a new structure of interrelatedness; and 4, the widening and deepening of community. Now, when I put this into the pattern language of Tim Winton's pattern dynamics, for me it becomes: 1, emerging awareness as a flow of energy finding resonance; 2, meanings from others integrated with what one already has, the storing of some of that energy flow as resource; 3, as the energy continues to flow and combines with the new resource, we can experience the expanding increase of qualitative meaning as a transformative of one's structure. The individual sees what could not be seen before, and he feels what he could not feel before, according to Wyman. And finally, 4, the widening and deepening of community. There's a new level of collective power created by this exchange and the flow of energy between individuals. When Wyman discussed the creative event, he used all of these words. He used the words energy, transformation, structure, power, and so on. Wyman once commented that the one great enemy of the creative event is rigidity, commitment to limited values, closedness to new experiences and possibilities. To close, I wanted to mention that in his later years, Wyman acknowledged problems with using the term God. He said, a word becomes very misleading when it has acquired a conventional meaning contrary to what one wishes to discuss. So it doesn't matter whether people believe in a concept of God. What matters is whether they believe in the concept of creative transformation. Gary Dorian has summarized Wyman's late life position, saying, true religion is evidence-supported ultimate commitment. Faith is the act of commitment to creative good. Revelation is the transforming power that operates in religious fellowship. The world is saved by creative transformation, which was Wyman's stand-in for grace. Thank you.
Thanks, Bruce, for inviting me to share on religious naturalism and what I think it uniquely offers at this time in terms of both the science and religion conversation, but far more importantly, understanding our perilous and crazy times. So what I'd like to do, I just came out with a course. It was just launched on Earth Day called Pro Future Faith. The Prodigal Species Comes Home. And it really is sort of my best articulation to date of what I would say is a Gaian religion or religious naturalist, spiritual religious worldview and sense of reality. So I'll go through that because I think the most important thing is the fact that an evidence-based worldview has got to be incorporated into any understanding of religion and spirituality, because otherwise we take as authoritative what was perhaps considered or experienced authoritative in the past, but may not be current or relevant today, given today's challenges and issues. And so the most important thing that religious naturalism brings is an undeniable, inescapable, living God. An understanding of the divine that is synonymous with reality and what reality is telling us through our subjective experience, of course, but also scientific evidence, historic evidence, and cross-cultural evidence is God's word. That's the voice of reality. That's what reality is telling us. Global collective intelligence, not just tribal collective intelligence or the intelligence of the elders, not just regional or traditional collective intelligence, but literally global collective intelligence where there are Christian scientists, atheist scientists, Buddhist scientists, Hindu scientists, scientists from every religious tradition and no religious tradition that are contributing to our best evidential understanding, interpreted collectively, interpreted inspiringly about what reality is telling us. One of the things that we learn that's most important is that there is a fundamental distinction between self-destructive cultures or self-destructive civilizations and stable, sustainable cultures. That is, cultures that can live in place without destroying the place, and civilizations that live in place and destroy the place. And it turns out that 97% roughly, depending upon whether you start humanity with Homo habilis 2.5 million years ago or Homo sapiens 400, 500,000, 300,000 years ago, it's 97 to 99% of human history, but we were able to live in place without destroying that place. We lived more or less sustainably. That is, we lived in a mutually enhancing relationship with primary reality. And primary reality, what I mean is our material creator, sustainer, and end. We know of no sustainable cultures that don't relate to what we would today call in a secular language, ecosphere, the biosphere, the ecosphere, as divine, as a greater thou, not a lesser it. And we don't know of any culture that relates to the ecosphere as an it that doesn't self-destruct. It turns out that our God concept, our concept of ultimate reality matters, because if we think we can go without any concept of God, then we tend to have nothing that puts us in a subservient place, a humble place next to that which is greater than us, namely nature or the universe or the ecosphere. I interpret all the language about idolatry and the stark warnings in ancient traditions, ancient cultures against idolatry, is idolatry has nothing to do with believing in the wrong God. It's got nothing to do with bowing down to statues or any of that kind of stuff. It's basically when your worldview has you treat primary reality, the soil, the forest, the water, the life upon which you depend, as something other than primary. It's human-centeredness. Anthropocentrism is idolatry. Ecocentrism or life-centeredness is the only thing that's sustainable. So that's why every sustainable culture for which we have evidence had what I would call an eco-theo worldview. That is, their understanding of eco was divine, and their understanding of theo incorporated what the living world was telling us in terms of how to live in right relationship to reality. So that's the first most important thing, is that only a religious naturalism perspective, to my mind, gives a living God, an undeniable God. And it's not about believing in anything. It doesn't matter whether you believe in the universe or not, but we need to live in right relationship to the universe. So it's like nesting dolls, Russian nesting dolls. And any concept of God that is not the whole of reality, personified, deified, an I-thou relationship to everything that we depend upon and everything that makes us up. Like our microbiome is part of what God's doing in the world, what his reality is up to. So that's the first thing that religious naturalism brings, is an undeniable, inescapable, a green, living God, a God that's not merely invisible, but a God that is also blue, green, and brown, let's just say. The second thing is an understanding of the evolutionary significance of religion and the religious necessity of science. It turns out when you step back and look at big green history, that is the history of everyone and everything, is sometimes called the epic of evolution or the universe story. Connie's and my main website is thegreatstory.org. And what we mean by the great story is simply the story that includes all stories. It includes all secular and religious stories. It's the story of physical evolution, biological evolution, and cultural evolution as our first and only globally produced evidence-based creation story. One of the first things we learn is, as I mentioned before, the difference between sustainable and unsustainable cultures. Sustainable cultures tend to, that is, cultures that don't foul their own nest, cultures that don't defile or degrade or despoil everything they depend upon, soil, forest, water, life, etc., other species, do so both because they have an I-thou relationship, but they also have a humility so that the living world is treated as teachers, not merely tools. It's not merely resources for our benefit and a place for our waste. And it turns out that unsustainable cultures tend to have a linear, unidirectional, and often, almost always, human-centered understanding. We have over 100 examples, it's probably about 120 examples, of unsustainable civilizations in the last 6,000 or 7,000 years that became great over 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 centuries and then collapsed over a half a century to 2 centuries. And that pattern has repeated again and again. In fact, Luke Kemp, back in February of 2019 in the BBC Future series, published a thing called Are We on the Road to Civilizational Collapse? And he actually has a chart that shows 88 civilizations between 4000 BCE and 1000 of the Common Era. So that 5,000 year period, he shows 88 civilizations, how long they lasted, where they were in the world, and what they died of. And it turns out, as Arnold Toynbee, the famous historian who saw culture side by side, as did Spengler also, and Vico, these historians that look at the common patterns of the rise and fall of civilizations. It turns out that they don't die, they commit suicide. Arnold Toynbee said that. He said, great civilizations don't just die, they take their own life. And so human-centeredness tends to be the downfall. That's why I say human-centeredness is really idolatry. It's relating to primary reality as a lesser it that we can exploit because we think it's all about us. Whereas sustainable cultures have a more circular or sometimes spiral, but there's an understanding of the patterns and that there's nothing more important than honoring and respecting and preserving what Teddy Goldsmith called the way. His magnum opus, Teddy Goldsmith was one of the most important writers on the difference between sustainable and unsustainable cultures. He looked at 500 years of anthropological evidence and showed some of the common patterns. And as different as these cultures are, one of the most common things, he wrote about this first in his book, The Stable Society, in like 1978 or something like that. And then his magnum opus, The Way, an ecological worldview. And he talked about the fundamental thing was relating the sense that all benefits and all real wealth come from what I'm calling God, G-O-D-D-E. And I spell God, G-O-D-D-E, because there's power in a single syllable word that means that greater thou, which is our creator, sustainer, and end. And what I'm meaning by God, G-O-D-D-E, that's the old English spelling. But what I'm not meaning is a being outside the universe that you need to believe in or disbelieve. What I'm meaning is the ecosphere plus everything that makes the ecosphere possible. So primary reality, fundamental reality. One of the common core several beliefs that every sustainable culture seems to have had is that all benefits and all real wealth come from the ecosphere, come from God, G-O-D-D-E. It's also gender neutral. A lot of feminists and Catholic nuns are actually using that spelling now. Reality, let's just say life. Okay, life will only continue to dispense these benefits and wealth if its critical order or way is preserved. Therefore, the fundamental role of religion or life ways is to ensure that the future is never compromised by the present. That is to ensure accountability of the future. That's the fundamental role of religion. That's the ecological and evolutionary role of life ways or religion, is to ensure that the future is never compromised by the present, or accountability to the future. That we get from a religious naturalist worldview is an understanding of the evolutionary significance of religion and the ecological significance of religion, because religion insists on limits. Limits are sacred and must be honored. There's a limit to how much we can take. It's called carrying capacity in the ecological world, but there's a carrying capacity. Every bioregion, every continent in the planet has a carrying capacity. That is a limited amount that you can take from it and a limited amount of waste you can exude to it before the systems break down. And so those limits must be honored upon pain of death or ostracizing. And so that's what sustainable cultures have in common. So Teddy Goldsmith identified religion. He actually defined religion as the control mechanism of stable, sustainable societies, meaning that it was that element that spoke with moral authority that the future cannot be compromised by the present. We must be accountable to the future. And there was a sense of continuity with time. That when you died, you didn't just go away, you were an ancestor. They consulted the ancestor. When you died, you became an ancestor. And you consulted, again, in your imagination, obviously, but you consulted imaginatively your descendants. This idea of living in the present with the seventh generation in mind isn't just a good idea. To do otherwise is evil. And so there was a continuity with time. In other words, the past and the future were related to as thous, that you listened to and you honored and you respected. And the living world was related to as a thou. Western anthropology has taken us down this dead-end path, thinking of gods and goddesses as disembodied beings or spirits or entities. No, they were personifications of what's inescapably real. So religious naturalist understanding of myths and religions talks about the fact that Gaia was not the goddess of the earth or the spirit of the earth. Gaia was a personification or a deification of the earth, which is inescapably real. The same is true with all different spirits. Even for the Hebrews, the Holy Spirit wasn't anything you needed to believe in. It was a personification of the wind and the breath. Ruach Adonai, Ruach Elohim. So the necessity of science is that science provides our best evidential understanding of how things are and which things matter. And every culture has had to have an understanding of what's real and what's important, how things are and which things matter. So a religious naturalist understanding of God is inescapably real. That is reality with a personality, not a person outside reality. A religious naturalist understanding of religion is that element of society that speaks with moral authority about accountability of the future. And if a culture is living in a way that's unaccountable to the future, only religion can try to bring it back. The problem is the last 2,500, 3,000 years, which is when all the axial faiths came into existence, these religions evolved in cultures that were already so unsustainable, they couldn't realistically hold the culture accountable. So religion degraded or downgraded or lessened to not being the control mechanism, but a coping mechanism. And often religion gets taken over by the elites and the powerful to justify their power. So undeniable God, evolutionary understanding of the significance of religion and the necessity of science. And then the big picture that every culture has to have a creation story. That's our story that tells us who we are, where we are in time and space, what matters, what's important. And it turns out that science is for helping us to understand reality. Myth and religion is for helping us relate to reality. And that's why personification is not an option. If we don't personify, that is, if we don't relate personally to primary reality, we tend to exploit it. And that's the essence of unsustainability, is not preserving the way of life, the way things have evolved for millions of years, and in aligning humans with that way. It's thinking that the more we can change things, in fact, the unsustainable worldview is that all benefits and all real wealth come from humans and human domination and human development and progress. And so the myth of perpetual progress is this idea, this linear understanding that it's all about us. And I think the most ecocidal, self-destructive worldview in human history, from a religious naturalist perspective, would be man, conqueror of nature. No, we're not the conquerors of nature. And turns out that techno-optimism is unjustified. Naive techno-optimism is unjustified if you don't distinguish nature's technology, God's technology, G-O-D-D-E, life's technology, with human technology. All technologies that have evolved over millions and billions of years, at the end of their life, they become food for other organisms. That's the nature of natural technology, all the technologies that created over time. And the bugs are worked out by evolution. That's the nature of the process. Most human technologies, when they die, they either become toxic or just sort of inert, but most of the time toxic. And so human technology that doesn't integrate with life's technology is always counterproductive over time. And that is, it always causes more problems than it solves. It just does it over time. So we externalize the true costs. So the last two things that a religious naturalism brings is an understanding of human nature and an understanding of impermanence and death that are both sacred. And human nature, that is, we understand why we struggle, why we get addicted, why we're tempted, why you're living in this kind of a world, this modern, postmodern world, this industrial world can become so challenging, because we have instincts that evolve for millions of years, long before even hominids. Our instincts evolved to help us survive and thrive in the garden, to speak mythically, in the garden. That is when humans lived as one creature among other creatures and related to God, reality, the living world, in an intimate, personal way. Our instincts become problematic in human-centered, city-based civilizations where we think it's all about us. That's why our instincts sabotage us. So for many years, I did programs on an evolutionary understanding of our basic instincts: the reptilian brain, the old mammalian brain, our neocortex, our monkey mind, and then our prefrontal cortex. And anybody interested can find that on the Great Story website. Just click on Evolutionize Your Life, and there's a whole course that Kai and I created. In fact, my first TEDx talk in Grand Rapids was why we struggle and suffer. It's all about understanding what a religious naturalist understanding of human nature brings, and how it can help us live in greater integrity. Integrity, really, I see as right relationship to reality. It's right relationship to our personal reality, our social reality, our ecological reality, and ultimate reality, which includes it all. And then death. I mean, a religious naturalist understanding of death, of impermanence, is that death is absolutely essential in this universe. In fact, for about 7 or 8 years, Connie and I did programs on a sacred science or evidential understanding of death, but that's meaningful, that's inspiring. Turns out that death is necessary at all scales of the universe. You can't even have a universe if you don't have death. So getting impermanence and death, and really getting it, like letting it in, like feeling it, and allowing you to trust that death is not only natural and necessary, it's no less sacred than life. And so this became really important to me 10 years ago because I was diagnosed with an aggressive form of cancer that could have killed me in 8 months. And I came to this, I had one day of pretty much freak out, but then I had this peace that passes understanding. That's what religious people call it. I had this profound gratitude for the past up to that moment, and trust that whether I died in 8 months or 18 years or 38 years, I'm going to die. And whether our species goes extinct in 20 years or 5 million years, it's most likely going to be in that time frame. And on a cosmic time scale, 5 million years is just, in fact, if you compress the whole history of the universe into 100 years, 5 million years is less than 2 weeks on the cosmic century timeline. And so life continues on. So my faith is in life. My faith is in God, G-O-D-D-E. That is the reality with a personality. My faith is in the ecosphere plus everything that makes that possible. It's not about beliefs. And I accept my mortality. I accept the impermanence of everything. And that allows me to be a passionate activist and advocate for pro-future. That is, doing everything I can, given my gifts and limitations, to be an influence on human beings, to call us as a species home to God, home to reality, home to the living ecosphere, and calling us back to accountability to the future, which is really the fundamental role of religion as I see it. So I cover all of that in spades in this course called Pro-Future Faith. Just came out with Living the Questions, and it's 8 20-minute sessions. So the whole thing is like 2 hours and 20 minutes, and it's got a study guide and all that kind of stuff. So I think in concluding this little sort of quick and dirty introduction to religious naturalism, I would like to cite my creed or my credo, my faith statement, as it were. And I'll explain it just very, very briefly. This is sort of a religious naturalist or sacred realist. I consider myself a sacred realist, a religious naturalist, an evidential mystic. That is, evidence helps me have a more intimate personal relationship to the whole of reality within and around me. So reality is my God. Evidence is my scripture. Big green history is my creation story. That is, the epic of evolution is my creation story. Ecology is my theology. Integrity is my spiritual path. And again, as what I mean by integrity is the mindset and the heart set that help me live in right relationship to reality. The practices, exercises, and tools that help me live in right relationship to what's fundamentally, undeniably, and inescapably real. And of course, that includes the ecosphere. So reality is my God. Evidence is my scripture. Big green history, or the epic of evolution, is my creation story. Ecology is my theology. Integrity is my spiritual path. And promoting accountability to the future is my mission. And I've found that those 6 principles actually unite tens of millions of people around the world. Obviously, I haven't spoken to that many people, but I've tried it out in very different secular and religious audiences, literally from atheists to evangelicals and everything in between, including several integral groups that I've spoken to, a couple of large gatherings, and liberal, progressive Christians, Catholics, as well as a lot of secularists. And what I found is that the secular folk, they don't feel comfortable quite with God talk. They might frame it like reality is my ultimate commitment, and evidence is the way reality reveals itself, and so forth. And I found that those on the more conservative religious spectrum often feel more comfortable saying something like, my God includes reality, my scripture includes evidence, my theology includes ecology, and that sort of thing. One of the things that a religious naturalist perspective brings, and that is an understanding that allows us to be in a place of what I call post-doom with respect to the challenges of our time. And I have just instituted and have started interviewing people around the world. About every 4 or 5 years, I do a conversation series. I did one back in 2010 called The Advent of Evolutionary Christianity, where I interviewed like 38 of the world's top Catholic and Protestant evangelical theologians and ministers that are authors that fully embrace ecology and evolution, that fully embrace evolution as sacred. So I interviewed those. And then about 5 years ago, I had a conversation series titled The Future is Calling Us to Greatness, where I interviewed like 56 of the world's top climate scientists and sustainability experts, and a sprinkling of religious leaders, spiritual leaders that help us hold this scary stuff without just freaking out. Well, just a few months ago, I had this vision, Connie and I both, of creating another series that we call Post-Doom. Regenerative conversations exploring overshoot grief, gratitude, and grounding. And it's like the cream of the crop. I mean, from Joanna Macy and Jim Bendel and Catherine Ingram, all these amazing people. It's very exciting because there seems to be a real interest in having post-doom conversations. That is, people who get that we're in contraction. They get that we're in collapse. They get that industrial civilization is not sustainable. And ultimately, anything that's not sustainable at some point isn't sustained. And of those 100 previous examples, or 120, the reason I say 120 is that Luke Kemp, in his article in the BBC, talked about 88 cultures, but he only looked at a 5,000-year period. He didn't go back before 4000 BC, and he didn't look at the last 1,000 years. That's why the real number is like 120 civilizations that we know of that became great and crashed. And they all did so for very similar reasons. Overshoot is the main reason. That is, they use more resources and exude more waste and grow too many people until the ecosystem collapses, until there's a bottleneck. So this understanding of doom is that sort of emotional experience that you get that, oh my God, perpetual progress is a myth. It's a secular religion. It's been the main secular religion of the industrial world, but it's not the truth. And we are now about to pay the consequences that are inevitable. I like this quote from Robert Louis Stevenson. He said, "Sooner or later, we all sit down to a banquet of consequences." And I consider that the great reckoning. We are in the early stages of the great reckoning. And when you really get that, it feels like doom for most of us. We, however, could also very well be in the early stages of the great homecoming. Humanity, the prodigal species, after squandering our inheritance, waking up to our predicament in the pig pen, as it were, and coming home to reality, to God, to life, as life really is. And so this post-doom conversation, having conversations with people who get that, who get the bad news, who've moved through whatever grief and anguish and anger and frustration, denial they needed to move through, and then find ways of being a blessing to their community, being on purpose and equanimous most of the time with themselves, but then also with others. So that's a huge piece of my legacy work for the coming 6 months or longer. So anyway, thanks for inviting me to share sort of what I see as some of the core nutshells of religious naturalism and eschatology.
What's up? How you doing today? I am David Long. You probably know me as a YouTuber and the founding member of the Integral Emergentist Revolutionary Movement, or Integral 2.0. Today I'm going to be talking to you about sacred naturalism, or better put, an integral approach to the healthy and skillful integration of religion and spiritual practice. Before we get started, I'd like to give a big thanks and a big shout out to Bruce Alderman for putting all this together. Thanks so much. It's a true blessing to be able to be here on the Integral stage. Also want to give big shouts out to my buddy Kai, who's also on this video, and I'm super excited and honored about being able to collaborate on this video with Michael Dowd. I've been a huge fan of his for a long time. All right, let's get into it. As an integralist, I feel comfortable with a lot of different worldviews. To me, religious systems are symbol sets. They're almost more like languages than they are creeds or belief systems. So I genuinely feel like I could identify as an agnostic, an atheist, a Christian, a Buddhist, a pagan, and an integral philosopher. And all of these things are consistent with one another and harmonize with each other. I'm not talking about picking from the buffet of religion and just taking what I want based on my own preferences. I'm talking about having a skillful integration based on a rigorous methodology and understanding of overarching patterns and underlying themes. I'm not talking about a case of special pleading. I'm talking about integrating with consistent standards. So how do we do that? Well, first let me say that an integral perspective is a postmodern perspective. At a postmodern stage of development, there is a general deconstruction of meaning and value. We realize that all language is just word games that we're playing with each other. And at a certain point, all we have to communicate anything is symbols and poetry and storytelling. And what we also realize is that even our logical, rational, objective facts and truth is just a really well qualified, really consistent, and really accurate type of storytelling. So I'm not talking about creating a flatland where we say that no symbols are more accurate than others. Clearly, some symbols are better than others for particular things, but it really depends on the context. So we understand that all of our ways of talking about things are a type of relative truth and not the absolute truth. There is no absolute meaning or purpose. And so another one of the problems that arises in postmodernism is this existential crisis of meaninglessness. And if there's no inherent value There's this kind of fear of this nihilistic void. And on the other side of that, if there's a jewel of existentialism and postmodernism, it's this idea about creating your own meaning and purpose and values. So an integral sacred naturalism is basically a type of belief, not like where you believe that there's inherent meaning or value in the cosmos, but a type of belief like deciding to believe, choosing to see life as sacred, as valuable, as meaningful, as important, as God, as divine, as sacred. And in integral theory, we talk about God in first, second, and third person perspectives, which means that in a first person perspective, I'm God. In a second person perspective, you're God. We're all manifestations of this universe. So everyone's God. Everything, the whole world of nature and the cosmos is itself divine or sacred. And again, this isn't a fact claim. It's a decision about how you want to live your life, how you want to see the world and yourself, and how you think we should meet with each other and value the environment. It's a decision about creating meaning and thus creating a better world through creating a good meaning, creating subjective meaning that's healthy and harmonizes with intersubjective meaning, or create a personal meaning that also is healthy and harmonizes with other people's meaning. For example, it's generally a good thing to treat other people like they're important, that they have value and that they're sacred. You would hope that goes without saying, but... So I use these different archetypes of the cup and the sword. These are what I call the transrational tools. The sword is logic, it's rationality, it can make clear discernments and cut through the bullshit. The cup represents poetry and beauty and symbolism and art and archetypes and metaphor and symbolism. The sword is more masculine, the cup is more feminine, and they're intertwined because, as I said before, even our most accurate symbols are poetic. But also, poetry makes sense. Michael Dowd basically makes this same distinction, but he talks about day language and night language. What he means by that is that day language, or rationality, the normal way we think about things, has a certain type of logic, while night language, or dream language, has a different kind of logic. The example that he uses is, imagine if I told you that for lunch I turned myself into a crow and flew over to Dairy Queen and then hung out with the birds for a while. If I was speaking to you in regular day language, you would probably advise me to seek help. But if I told you about a dream I had last night, you would maybe wonder what the dream means. So it's a different way of thinking about the ideas and symbolism, and basically he's making this same distinction. Religious symbolism and metaphor is best understood with night language type logic, and generally when you apply the day language type of logic to it, it breaks down and fails. What happens a lot of times is people end up taking poetry literally and missing the point. So for example, the story of the tortoise and the hare is not about a tortoise and a hare in a race. It's about you and me and how we live our life. And so a lot of religious allegory and mythology is very similar in this way. There's a lot of wisdom and meaning in this mythology. Notice I said the word mythology because I think it's also important to realize that other mythologies and symbol sets, Lord of the Rings, Star Wars, The Matrix, the list goes on, are also a form of sacred scripture, of mythology, of human psychology. And as Michael Dowd would probably argue, even our scientific stories and evidence should be looked at as sacred scripture, and even taken more seriously in a day language kind of way, especially if this is some of the most accurate storytelling that we have. So the sword is the boon or the treasure that one earns in the orange stage of development, while the cup is the boon or the treasure that one earns or learns when they're at the green stage of development. And an integralist includes both skillfully, because integral is the synthesis of orange and green. So it's transrational, integrating diversity with discernment. It's rational plus. It transcends and includes rationality to also include mythology or poetry, and this is that transrationality. So with these tools in hand, I would like to further explore these different titles that I said were coherent and consistent with one another, and explain how exactly that is. Then we'll explore the pros and cons of these different traditions, and how, in a sense, they kind of need each other to be well-rounded. And in that regard, how this integral practice can actually be the best approach to religion and spiritual practice. All right, first and foremost, let's talk about agnosticism and atheism. So in terms of epistemology, as we already mentioned, all we have are language games to be able to reference reality from an inherently limited perspective in time and place. So we not only have subjective limits, but we also have relative limits. And both of these things keep us from knowing the absolute truth. So this is that agnosticism. There are a couple of sayings I really like when it comes to this hard agnostic perspective, like, not just I don't know, but you don't know either. He who thinks he knows doesn't know, and he who knows he doesn't know knows. In Integral, we have a version of it that says the map is not the territory. In other words, the relative map is not the absolute truth of the territory. So we don't get to make claims about the absolute truth. So the agnostic thing is more of a claim about our ability to know the absolute truth. And so in this case, the absolute is God, or God is the ultimate mystery beyond all categories of human thought. And it's often thought of in an anthropomorphized or human-centric kind of a way, where people think there's a literal God or something that's transcendent of all reality, and that it's a person who intercedes in life. So an atheist is a person who doesn't believe in this personal, literal interpretation of God. So in one sense, I'm a hard agnostic. I don't think we can know the absolute mystery of all reality. And also, I don't believe in any of these religious traditions in a literal way. I think there's tons of good poetic value to be had in there. But basically, the general approach that I take to religion is to read it as mythology. And I learned this approach from Joseph Campbell, who is the godfather of comparative mythology. And Ken Wilber even says that he gets the idea of the pre-trans distinction from him. He just requalifies it in developmental terms. So pre and post the rational stage. Pre-rational ideas are magical and mythical. The rational approach is to get evidence to see if something is literally true or not. And the trans-rational approach is to read these symbols metaphorically as archetypes of human psychology explored through narrative. Basically, humans are trying to understand what's going on in reality. This mystery beyond all categories of thought, and all we have are stories to tell about it. Going back to the hard agnostic thing, this is why Joseph Campbell says that your ultimate name, image, and concept of God is your ultimate boundary from God. Because what happens is that most people end up worshiping some mental idol instead of really being open to mystery. We're talking about vicarious atonement, praying to it, believing in the story literally, and having a superstition about history, instead of realizing that I'm in the desert, I'm being tempted, and how am I going to live? Waking up every day and being it. So religious naturalism is going to find divinity in nature, not in some projection of transcendent glory, but we see immanent reality itself as sacred. So humans are storytellers, and basically these different traditions are more like different languages, different symbol sets, different ways of talking about reality and our experience. Now granted, these religious traditional ways of talking about things are pretty outdated ways of talking about things. However, there are tons of people who do speak these kinds of languages now, and it's good to be able to get in touch with what's going on there. So it's really good to understand what the universal themes are, and to be able to also understand what the different cultural costumes those universal themes come in. So you can know what's universal, and you can understand different traditional variations. And of course, there are personal variations too. So if we go back to the idea of interpreting a dream, there are going to be universal aspects to the symbolism, there are going to be relative cultural aspects to the symbolism, and there are going to be subjective personal aspects to the symbolism. Maybe even all within the same archetype. Like, for example, the archetype of mother is a universal symbol, but there could also be cultural and personal variations on that archetype. Again, we're talking about human psychology. All of these traditions have a concept of God or the absolute or what's sacred or what's ultimate. They all have different conceptions of what that means, but you have to also realize that people who came up with these ideas a long time ago were thinking in a different way. Before we developed these highly rational systems and these incredibly accurate descriptions for things, language in itself was more poetic. You would say Zeus is raining, and it wasn't necessarily even taken that literally by the people who came up with it. And then later on, as development continues, the children of those people start to question whether it was true or not, and start to get in debates about it and argue about it. Again, Michael Dowd uses this example. It's like arguing about whether Uncle Sam is real or not. It misses the point, and it's a confusion about language. So this gets me into two versions of the pre-trans fallacy. Remember earlier we introduced this idea of pre-rational ideas are magical and mythical, and trans-rational ideas are metaphorical or poetic. There are two main types of problems that happen. The first version of the pre-trans fallacy is usually committed by people at a rational stage of development. And what happens is they reduce all religion to childish bullshit. It's all just immature, it's all just the future of an illusion. It's all something to be outgrown. And maybe some people who are watching this are thinking to themselves, Christianity is reducible to believing in a literal Jesus and a literal God, and if you don't believe that, then you're not really a Christian. And maybe it's true that you're not really what most people would consider a Christian, but Christianity, like Buddhism, like paganism, like all of these traditions, has a rich history with diverse translations of symbolism, and whole traditions cannot be reduced to what might now be a single current expression. These traditions are historically born at a more traditional stage of development, but now that they exist, these traditions are interpreted by people at every stage of development. So what it means to be a Christian or a Buddhist or a pagan is different for a young child who's initiated into these traditions or is first hearing about them versus a more mature person or versus a more wise adult. Again, these are more like languages than a particular hard and fast belief system. And if you really understand the history of these ideas, you'll see that this idea of understanding these symbols metaphorically is deep in a lot of these traditions. For example, I'm more of a student of Christianity, but in Corinthians, there's verses about not reading these things in the flesh, but reading them in the spirit. To read them in the flesh is foolishness to most people. They have to be read in the spirit in which they're written. This implies this metaphorical interpretation. I'll give you another example. There's a story in the Bible about the day of judgment where God will cast out the ones that he never knew. And they'll say things like, but Lord, we prayed a million prayers and we cast out demons in your name and we went to church every Sunday. And God will say, yeah, but when I needed a place to stay, when I was hungry, you didn't feed me, you turned me away. When I was in prison, you didn't visit me. And they'll be like, but Lord, you never came or we would have helped you. And he's like, listen, if you don't see Christ in your brother, then you never knew me. Get away from me. So it's right there in the Bible. I don't know how else you would interpret that. The point is that it's not about paying lip service to it. It's about really recognizing Christ in your brother, recognizing this body of Christ and living as a sacrifice, living as a vehicle of love to help and bless the world. So there's powerful metaphor in there, and this is a great example of why I feel comfortable calling myself a Christian, because I recognize Christ in my brother. I recognize Christ in the world. I recognize that my body is a temple, that I and the Father are one. I try to die to my ego every day and live as a vehicle for God. That's valid poetry about how I try to live my life. I grew up in a very Christian home, so I was very steeped in these ideas, and this more transrational approach, where you wake up every day and you be it, as opposed to just pray to it, actually makes one a better Christian. Now, of course, the other version of the pre-trans fallacy is when you try and lift up pre-rational ideas to trans-rational level that they just are not worthy of. And you see Ken Wilber do this with the idea of I amness before the Big Bang, where he basically believes in some Buddhist or Hindu creation myth and builds his philosophical cosmology around a religious experience and claims to know the absolute truth. This is one example of a pre-trans fallacy number 2, and unfortunately, it is far too common in the integral community. Steve McIntosh is another person who hangs out on the integral scene, and he advocates for belief in a literal God, and he believes there's going to be some kind of future omega point. That's another good example of the pre-trans fallacy. Usually the pre-trans fallacy or pre-trans confusion happens around green, but it's early days for integrals still, so the cognitive line runs ahead, and it takes time to learn how to really practice these things, and we're still learning to make these distinctions in clear ways and really live them out. And that is why there needed to be an integral emergentist revolutionary movement or an integral 2.0. But back to the religious traditions. So why not just be an integral Christian then? Why also a Buddhist and a pagan? Why include these other traditions? Well, for one, more symbols to be able to talk about your experience gives you more perspective. And you don't want to become the ultimate nerd for one symbol set. Imagine if you were hanging out with a person and they constantly brought everything back to Star Wars metaphors. Oh, this reminds me of the Force. This is just like when Luke Skywalker unmasks his father. This would be also a good place to pause and to say that someone like Michael Dowd has studied plenty of different symbol sets, and he certainly understands that there are many ways to talk about universal ideas and can probably cross-culturally translate to a lot of different traditions himself. I know Michael Dowd is a big fan of Joseph Campbell too. I really respect the project that he's taken on to upgrade Christianity and to translate a healthy version of Christianity down the spiral. So I think what he's doing is very important work. we definitely want to see transrational expressions of each tradition, so that way that territory is well mapped and we can all have a better understanding of what it looks like to take a transrational interpretation of those traditions. So that's certainly important work. The thing is that each one of these traditions has its great area of strength, but its greatest strengths are also its greatest weaknesses and limitations. You could almost think of each tradition as a different human experiment, and we can see the consequences of having valued things in this particular way. Because while each of these traditions brings its great value and its great strength, they also each tend to have their own huge blind spots and ways in which they go to extreme. We're talking about Christianity, so let's start there. Christianity is great at the lower left quadrant, at the we space. It's all about living as a vehicle of love to the world, to the second person. Like, think of the example I gave earlier about, did you see Christ in your brother? Are you really living for Christ? Are you willing to die to yourself and live for others as a vehicle of love? Are you going to love your neighbor? So it can be very good at self-sacrifice. But you also run into these problems where people can become doormats. Like, how many times should you turn the other cheek when someone slaps you? 70 times 7. Well, that just means that you're going to sit there and get slapped over and over and over again, killing someone with kindness. And that's not going to work for everyone. That's a great recipe for disaster in certain situations. That being said, each tradition does have its ways to include the other quadrants. So you could be including all 4 quadrants in your spiritual practice in a healthy way inside of each of these traditions. But you really have to be mindful and careful to do so. Buddhism tends to focus heavily on the upper left quadrant, all about God in first person. So Buddhism is mostly focused on state training practices. So basically, with a few exceptions like bodhisattvas and things like this, is that people tend to get very lost off in their own cave on their own mountaintop, and they tend to actually not care enough about the world, to not get involved enough. So they tend to neglect these other quadrants. But of course, in doing so, they've brought back tons of awesome information about how to master your own interiority. There's not really enough talk about paganism and magic as far as I'm concerned, but I really like the creative practices and the focusing and harnessing your will to achieve things in the world kind of practice. They've really mastered the power of mind and will and intention to create and to become. This is a great counterbalance to a lot of that stillness and being that you get in Buddhism. If you also harmonize it with the Christian idea of service and living for a greater good, if you can get all of these techniques and things together in one person, you're going to have a really powerful, healthy person and a really amazing spiritual practice. Not only can you find stillness, but you can create and become and manifest things in a way that serve the greater good. So you can actually get a really healthy balance. One of the problems of paganism is that it tends to be very much about the ego and self-serving without having mastered the self or gotten in touch with living for a greater good. So all of these things together can complement each other really well. And of course, if you bring into account philosophy, this brings the sword more online. Now we can have a good epistemology, we can have a good ontology, a good cosmology, and we can have a map of the world that we live in to be able to understand all of these factors. And we can really have both the cup and the sword. The really good thing about philosophy is that it tends to bring a very rigorous approach to truth. The bad thing about philosophy is that a lot of philosophers can tend to get very lost in their head and even get trapped in analysis paralysis and mental masturbation and all this, and they forget to come back down into the real world and do stuff. So if you can bring online this understanding, this control, this care for the greater good, and this personal interior self-mastery, you really have a complete and empowered spiritual process, and thus a complete and empowered being in the world. To me, it almost feels like being multilingual. Like I can talk to Christians and harmonize with them and point them in the direction of the greater good and give them healthy ways to integrate in these other quadrants that they might be neglecting or leaving out. I can do the same with a Buddhist. I can do the same with a pagan, and I can do the same with a philosopher. It really allows me to communicate with almost anybody and to potentially give them upgrades and tools to do better. Also, this approach really helps me to be able to see and engage with divinity in all 4 quadrants. quadrants. It is really a holistic approach to a spiritual practice. I think if I was to dive into this a bit further, I would also talk about how a realistic understanding of reality helps you get more in touch with impermanence and gratitude. This more integral developmental approach really helps with skillful engagement and patience with people who are in these different traditions. Also, when you really care and you're really empowered and you're really engaged, there's a kind of non-dual activism that comes online, where you want to engage deeply, but also you know you can only do what you can do. This is a general outline of my idea of an integral approach to religion and spirituality. I expound on these ideas further. I have other videos on my YouTube channel. I have a video about harmonizing spirituality and rationality that unpacks this stuff a lot deeper. I have a video specifically about a transrational interpretation of Christianity. I have a video that talks about non-dual synthesis and symbolism. Very similar to the talk I gave today, I have another talk about the 4 S's of an integral spiritual practice, which also touches these same quadrants. You might be interested in that if you enjoyed this. I also have a video deconstructing and reconstructing ideas around soul, self, awakening, afterlife, reincarnation, ghosts. What do we really think is going on with that kind of stuff? And what's a transrational emergentist, realistic perspective of what's going on with this? How can we save the baby from the dirty bathwater? You heard me mention a couple criticisms about Ken Wilber and Steve McIntosh. I also have videos unpacking my criticisms around some of that stuff. If you're interested, you can find that and dig into that as well. Joseph Campbell's Power of Myth is out on Netflix now. If you have that, that would be a great thing to check out. My buddy Alyosha and I have also been working on an Integral Review Live companion series to go along book club style with these Power of Myth videos. Thanks so much for listening to me. Thanks again to Bruce and the Integral Stage for having me. If you want to hear more, find me on YouTube. Thanks again. Peace.
Thank you for watching, and thank you, Bruce, for the invitation and for hosting these conversations. I often like to start my presentations by asking everyone to imagine a tree. I ask them to really see the tree, think about what it looks like and where it is. You may want to pause the video momentarily and imagine your own tree. This exercise brings our idea of a tree into full view for examination and gives insight into how we individually relate to trees. When I do this imaginal practice, the first tree that comes to mind is an oak. And we have many, many oaks here in the Bay Area of California where I live. The trees and plants outside our windows are intelligent, relational, and agential beings that deserve human respect and valuation. Many people think about trees and plants as those green things that sit outside, that we can use however we please. In the West, this view is rooted in the philosophical tradition, beginning with Plato and Aristotle, and has remained relatively unchanged in the literature. In my work, I trace this thought process through the philosophical literature and connect thinking about trees as little more than things to increasing global deforestation and environmental crisis. Humans have caused deforestation in areas like Europe and China since about 6,000 years ago, but the rates of deforestation have risen over the last decades, peaking in the 80s and 90s. Deforestation is a critical element of climate instability. Drawing on contemporary science from the last 15 years in plant signaling and behavior, and recent thought in the field of critical plant studies, I believe plants exhibit 3 capacities which portray the intrinsic value of their being. These capacities are intelligence, relationality, and agency. The first capacity that I'd like to discuss is intelligence. Here, intelligence is the ability to assess the environment and choose from among potentialities. Assessing the environment requires awareness, or a basic perception of surroundings, as well as memory of the past and learning from prior incidents. Trees and plants exhibit all of these qualities. Regarding awareness, no less than Charles Darwin and his son Francis Darwin studied movement in plants and noted the awareness of the radicle, or that first growing root from a seed, which are in constant and deliberate movement, always reacting to the environment. Regarding memory and learning, memory refers to the ability to use relevant information from past experience to address current situations, and learning requires both having a goal and a way to assess errors in the journey towards that goal. An example of plant memory and learning is Monica Galliano's work with Mimosa pudica, or the sensitive plant. And this is the plant that closes when touched. It's in a way that's on a human timescale, which is very quickly for a plant. Galliano designed an experiment where she dropped the plant several feet numerous times until it no longer closed its leaves in reaction to the drop, showing the learning that the drop was not a threat. The plant then continued to remember the drop and did not react 1 day, 6 days, even 28 days after the initial training, showing memory of the lack of a threat. But the plant did close as normal when it was shaken instead of dropped. Trees and plants are intelligent in the ways they attend to their environment and react in complex and adaptive ways. Some of these behaviors are perceptive to the human observer, like the pattern of branches reaching for sunlight openings and the brilliant colors of flowers and fruit calling to animals and insects to help the plants reproduce and spread the seeds. The second capacity that I'd like to talk about is relationality. Relationality describes the connections to other beings, whether symbiotic or not. Relations require a discernment of self and other, and the transfer and reception of information. Regarding the discernment of self, Omer Falik and teams showed that pea plants can distinguish between their own roots and the roots of other plants. It's called in the literature self-non-self discrimination. And the pea plants will avoid competing with their own roots by reducing the volume and length of the roots. If a pea plant root encounters genetically identical roots, it'll actually grow fewer and shorter roots. But if the other roots are not genetically identical, the plant grows both more and longer roots in competition. Similarly, Richard Carbon and team showed what they called kin recognition in sagebrush and found that plants distinguish self and non-self through chemical signals and use this information to cooperate against attacks from plant eaters. Sagebrush responds differently to more closely related plants. Regarding the transfer and reception of information, Suzanne Simard has studied mycorrhizal or fungal networks extensively, showing how trees provide nutrients and information to one another through the fungal networks connecting their roots. What she calls a mother tree or hub tree provides resources to other trees in its network. She's one of the leaders in this research and field of plant signaling and behavior. And all the way back in 1997, she and other researchers published an article in the journal Nature about this network nicknamed the Wood Wide Web. So a lot of those articles that you see about trees talking to each other is coming directly out of her work. Relationality is the easiest to see with human perception. Think of the give and take between animals and insects in the forest, and the ways that trees provide habitat and sustenance for many forest creatures, who also reciprocally interact with the trees. The final capacity I'd like to discuss here is agency. Agency is the capacity to decisively act rather than merely respond. And arboreal agency is by far the most difficult quality to experience as a human. Trees operate on such different timescales that a human would need to spend decades or a lifetime in close relationship to trees to perceive this action. Trees are making decisions that are imperceptible to humans all the time. However, we can see when some plants do not respond. One of the most interesting experiments has been with anesthetics. Ken Yokawa and team tested several plant species, including Mimosa pudica, the shy plant, pea plants, and garden cress, both by exposing them to anesthetic gases through their leaves and anesthetic liquids through their roots. The Mimosa pudica lost its ability to close its leaves when it was disturbed. Like I mentioned before, with the shaking or the dropping, it'll close its leaves, and with the anesthetics, it did not. And the pea plant stopped growing, which is usually in a rotational movement. It stopped growing for several hours. The researchers used the terminology of consciousness loss to describe the response to anesthetics. Recognizing these capacities in trees and plants leads me to see them as valuable beings, rather than just a natural resource or beautiful scenery as nature. If trees and plants are not seen as things, but instead as ontologically valuable beings, our relationship to trees and forests must then also change, and the respect entitled to them would give us pause before, for example, clear-cutting large areas of forest or wasting wood and wood products. The scientific research is also being addressed by critical plant studies scholars who are suggesting that plants be considered anew. Some, like Matthew Hall, suggest personhood for plants. I personally stop before granting plants personhood, and I'm also cautious not to call plants conscious in the sense of self-aware. But as I mentioned before, plants clearly are aware, so I prefer the term intelligence here, as I mentioned before. Other scholars, like Michael Marder, find that thinking about plants leads to a post-metaphysical position, that in their being, plants challenge Western metaphysical conceptions. After my research, I believe that looking at trees and plants more closely leads to a metaphysical position that's more complex than we have yet imagined, what I'm tentatively calling a lush metaphysic. So a lush metaphysic needs much more time to unpack, but in a brief sketch, it's relational and describes how multiple ontologically valuable beings exist as an interconnected network. This relational metaphysic could be the basis for an approach that respects trees. This does not mean that we can never take or use a tree, but instead means that when we do so with the well-being of both the trees and the forest in mind. It means that we take care of trees locally and globally, and we take care of the wood in our lives so as not to unnecessarily take trees. Respecting trees and plants is one of many ways toward a more sustainable world. And going back to that imaginal tree that I talked about at the beginning, I believe that our relationships to trees begin with the trees around us. We are already in relationship to trees, and we can continue to develop connections with both living trees and with trees as wooden or tree-derived items. Next time you see a tree, I hope you might take a moment to stop and see the tree differently. Thank you.
Hello everybody, my name is Kai, and today we're going to be talking about stone balancing as a practice in sacred naturalism. Let me begin by talking about my own experience in stone balancing and where I started. I've been balancing stones for years now, and it has been a continuous form of expression that I've found value in, not only because of its kinesthetic value, but also in its ability to balance the interiors as you act out the process. So what is stone balancing? There's many different styles of stone balancing. A couple different styles are your Karen, stack a rock on top of another rock on top of another rock, which has been historically used as grave markers, trail markers. This isn't the stone balancing we're going to be talking about today. We're going to be talking about the style of stone balancing that is the counterbalance. It was until this gentleman showed me how to balance a rock upright that I really started to see the impact that this art form could have. Once you're able to balance a rock on its point, you open up whole new avenues of creative potential and expression and complexity and difficulty in your freestanding sculptures. As a young adult, it became an art form that I was able to get away from the monotony of my job and the mind-numbing space of the internet. It gave me a reason to get out into nature and to create and express myself. But as I developed my communion with the art form, I began to realize that where the real magic was, how do you cultivate a space of non-attachment in the practice of doing? The form of art that really does help you center yourself so you can begin to master state control and how to manage your states. Sometimes it does not want to balance, and you might get frustrated. And as you get frustrated, it will begin to well, and your hands shake more and more and more, and stack just falls. Realize the frustration was happening, and stop and still yourself. Become the witness of these emotions and drop back into stillness and allow. Then your hands stay still, you level yourself, and you know what you need to do next. And so it has been a profoundly useful practice for me to realize in my own life when frustrations are coming up, when negative emotions begin to well. So now I can think about stone balancing in the act of doing detached from the outcome. Now I want to talk a little bit about the culture of stone balancing. It wasn't very long ago that very few people even did it. Historically, cairns have been used for thousands of years. But it wasn't until very recently that counterbalancing became a form of art. Very few people were doing it up until the moment that the internet came onto the scenes and started to connect everybody. What happened was a small group of people who were doing the art form all found each other online and had the first meeting of stone balancers. And so stone balancing can thank the internet for its popularity and the ideas that come along with it, because the community of stone balancers and earth artists is a green community of open-hearted love and acceptance, but also you find a lot of orange moving in to get in touch with the earth and nature. And it just clicks with them. I get to build these structures and also get to be a part of this community that accepts who I am, and I can start kind of breaking out of my own identity, binds people together. The sacred space that these totems then create, because they are ephemeral, and this stack here will only be standing for a short period of time before either the wind takes it down or somebody throws a rock at it. As the culture of stone balancing spreads, inevitably controversy will rise, and stone balancing is no exception. Controversies being people stacking too many rocks, pulling too many rocks out of the water, disrupting natural settings. A lot of people consider stone balancing a form of graffiti. They want to see nature. They don't want to see something that somebody made. There's a few distinctions that the controversies don't usually bring up, which is people lump all the different styles of stone balancing together. When people think of stone balancing, they think of cairns, and you create this highly stable structure that is not going anywhere anytime soon unless a flood comes in or somebody forcefully knocks it over. But this is not what counterbalancing or stone balancing is about. These balances are so delicate that a simple breeze can come in, and that's enough force to push it over, and then it all falls, because it all needs that top keystone to hold it in place. When people bring up stone balancing, that's what they're thinking about, is these cairns, and they're thinking about hundreds of people making hundreds of stacks that people make. They want to participate in stone balancing, but since they're not skilled yet in the art, they will just make a cairn, and they'll make lots of them. What stone balancers do is try to offset the controversy by practicing a leave no trace methodology to our balances. So stone balancing is this flux flow art form of doing and becoming and creating, but also in the act of doing all of that, the space of witness, of allowing your balance to go back to the earth so that you may go through the process again. In my life, it has been a discipline that has gotten me more in touch with my nature. So thank you all for watching and listening. My name is Kai, and I hope you enjoyed this talk on stone balancing as a form of practice into sacred naturalism. Thank you, and goodbye.